Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Nikitinaknits. My name is Evgeniya, and in this video I'm sharing 6 tips, 6 ways to improve your knitting to achieve a polished knit. I think there are 3 different types of knitters. First ones that don't really care about polished knits at all. They actually appreciate when the garment looks handmade and it has imperfections, even mistakes, and these type of knitters embrace the imperfectionism of the garment, we could say. The middle point is knitters who try to make the knit look really polished and nice, but if it doesn't work out, they don't stress too much, they don't get anxious about things, they don't reknit usually, and they keep wearing the garment because they're not as strict about polishing their knits, you could say. And the third group is knitters who actually care a lot, and they would spend time, they would unravel, they would really finish the knit until the point that they're satisfied. Of course, there's limits to all of that, how much you should get obsessed about your knitting. And I don't want this video to become like, oh, the knitting should be this way and the finished object should look like that. No, I want to just share my viewpoint on how I achieve the look that I'm aiming for, and my standards are quite high towards knitting. I don't have a lot of garments and I do care about every single detail. I do take my time to prepare, to knit, and to finish the garment. And if I'm not so happy about the finished work, there is a huge chance I'm not going to wear it, and I know that. So grab your knitting, grab your favorite drink. That I'm having some rooibos tea with milk. And let's dive into 6 ways to improve our knitting to achieve a polished and professional look. Well, the first thing I do on the way to achieve a polished look is to actually pick the correct design. I'm quite convinced that not every single design can be hand knitted to the point that is going to look very store-bought. There are quite a few constructions that we cannot simply achieve knitting by hand, and no matter how much we try, it's still going to look not so polished, not so store-bought. So in my case, there are quite a few constructions that I simply don't knit because I already know from the experience to make it look really nice, I will spend so much effort, and there's a big chance it's not going to satisfy me anyways. So the top that I'm wearing is one of the examples of such project. I self-drafted this top, there is no pattern for it, but it has so many little details and it is knitted with a plant-based yarn that I swear the amount of time I spent knitting this very small top would be as big as knitting a whole sweater. And after finishing the garment, I enjoy wearing it, I appreciate it in my wardrobe, but I swore that never again I'm going to be knitting anything with plant-based fiber that has a button band. There are a few more constructions that I prefer to avoid. However, I'm still looking for the pattern, for the yarn choice to maybe some days knit them, but I'm a bit careful about them. So the polos with a collar that have V-neck with double knitting that connects here in the bottom. It is quite hard to achieve it beautifully. There are a few patterns that look nice on designer's page, but if you go to Ravelry, you can see in so many works, in like 90% of works, I personally don't like how this thing connects here and the pulling that it creates and overall look. So I would have to put either a lot of effort again in choosing the correct yarn and knitting it, or I just choose not to just not have a headache of doing that. Another construction that I'm quite careful about is the cardigan with a crew neck. So this connection where you have crew neck connecting to the button band is a bit complicated to achieve in a very beautiful way because we have the angle and we have the ribbing and we should attach the button here on the top. Of course, one day I will be knitting one, and there are quite a few patterns that look beautiful, and with the correct yarn and correct technique we can do that. But again, how much effort is going to take from me, and I'm just careful about that. Other patterns that include ribbing in plant-based yarns, usually summer garments, I just don't do them. I either replace it with an I-cord or I don't do the ribbing. So that's an example. The amount of effort I put to make it look nice, and the elastic and very, very tiny needles, very slow knitting. I did not enjoy that. And that principle applies to any single design out there that I see. I go to designers page. Of course, I usually like it because designers polish their pictures. They do the best angles, the best lighting. They steam their projects correctly, and it's usually looking attractive and yummy, you could say. And then when you go to Ravelry or Instagram hashtags, you can see a lot of different works. And you can pick the average from those works. Do most finished objects look attractive to you? And because if yes, then probably you have also a high chance to achieve a beautiful look, polished according to your standards. If not, if most people could not achieve that polished look, then maybe it is quite hard to achieve at all. And honestly, it took me quite a few years to finally accept that I can't knit all of the garments to the level that I would be satisfied with. And so when I accepted it, I felt like the weight went out of my shoulders. But there are many patterns that are so beautiful and they don't require such huge effort to be looking very beautiful. So I decided I would better knit those projects for now rather than trying to perfect something by hand that could be only knitted by machine. My tip number 2 would be to make a big research on the pattern before actually knitting it. I am the person who would not prefer to risk and knit from designers who allow mistakes in the pattern, or designers who are not so careful about sizing and recommendations for positive ease and yarn. And overall, I'm trying my best to evaluate how much success I'm going to have from the pattern that I'm buying and that I'm knitting and that I'm trusting. The first thing I do usually is I try to not only look at the general look, like how stylish it is, how cool it is, wow, such a beautiful design. I really try to see the details that are not so noticeable. First of all, on designer's page, I try to see the neckline. I try to see any excess fabric that is forming under the arms or behind the back or here in the front. I try to be sober, not be too excited, and actually find imperfections and then question, do they bother me so much or not much? So after designer's page, as I mentioned in the previous point, I go to Ravelry and I see even more finished work from people. If I see it in one finished object, that's fine. It could be coincidence, but if I see it in many, many different finished objects, that might be something is with a pattern. And of course, I prefer to choose patterns from designers who take a lot of pictures, a lot of videos. One of them is the Knit Pearl Girl, for example. I really appreciate how much media she creates before releasing a pattern. You can see it in so many different angles. She even includes the videos sometimes in her Instagram page. And I really appreciate that because I know what I'm going to do and I know more or less what is going to be the finished result if I follow all of the recommendations from the designer, right? And honestly, I try my best to avoid knitting from magazines that I don't see finished work at all. Like you just see a beautiful picture in one angle and you can't really see any details, or patterns where the neckline is covered, for example, with a hair, or the lighting is bad, so I cannot see the details that I'm about to face. I prefer to avoid that, especially if this project doesn't have finished objects on Ravelry on Instagram. I just don't risk. The third thing I do to achieve the professional polished look in my knits is picking the right yarn. And this is my favorite. I think it's like 80% of success. And now, after quite a few years of experience, I realized how much it matters to my personal results. I don't play with the yarn anymore. I don't pick yarn just because it was in my stash and I don't want to buy the new one. So what do I usually do? I decide to knit a pattern and I look at the recommended yarn. If I like the look of that yarn in the pattern and if I like the recommended yarn, I would always go for that yarn. I prefer to not risk, to not guess, to not try, and just knit the project if I like the recommended yarn. If I don't like the suggested yarn, or it's too expensive, or it's unavailable to me, then the whole game begins. I start to look at the qualities that I want to achieve. I start to look at the details in the pattern that require different qualities of yarn. So for instance, if the design has a lot of different details to accomplish, it's a button band, it is shoulder where you have to pick up stitches, is color or anything that is requiring more details, I would prefer to go for a little bit more fuzzy yarn or add a little bit of fuzz towards the main strand to hide those imperfections that we will for sure achieve. And honestly speaking, I think mohair became so popular not because somebody started it and then it's like a snowball started to be a trend. I think mohair became popular because it hides a lot of imperfections and overall creates this little halo around the whole garment that makes the finished work way more polished and way more store-bought. Another fiber that does a similar job is alpaca and suri alpaca and cashmere. So these fibers release a very tiny fuzz. Alpaca has longer hairs, cashmere has very tiny fluff, but both fibers also kind of fill up the spaces between the stitches, and the fabric looks way more connected and complete. And even if you have a little bit of rowing out or any other issues, it may help to hide that. But of course, it's going to help just a tiny bit. It's not going to make the job instead of us. So when I'm about to replace the yarn, I will try to find out what quality am I looking for. Is it the same quality that the designer mentioned in her design, or do I want to achieve a different quality, and try to go for that yarn. For example, if we see a cabled sweater that needed with a lot of different details with rustic wool that is quite lightweight, and we realize that we don't want rustic wool on our skin and we want soft, gentle, ultrafine merino wool. And we go for, I don't know, Double Sunday by Sadness Garden, which is a very soft, silky, flowy merino wool. And we need the same garment. And that type of merino wool is way heavier, is way more shiny and flowy. And the whole sweater is going to look different. And if you don't have much experience in knitting with different yarns, or you don't know much about the yarn, the best way to realize that is to go again to Ravelry or Instagram and Finished Objects and try to see how it looks in close way and from the far. And of course, it's very nice to have different samples of different qualities in your stash, even if it feels like overwhelming or you want to get rid of those bowls. I have a lot of them and I keep them for this type of purposes. The fourth thing I do to achieve a professional and polished look on my knits is big, correct swatching, blocking, and doing my best to meet the gauge. And if I don't meet the gauge, I usually don't knit the project. In the beginning of my knitting journey, I usually skip this because it's boring, it takes time, and I'm so excited about the project. And why to care so much? And after pain, after mistakes, and after regrets, I take my time to swatch. So I'm not speaking about a little tiny swatch just to hit gauge. I'm speaking about quite a big swatch that is washed, blocked and steamed to see if I'm going to like it or not in the end, to feel the fabric, to see the drape, to play with it, and maybe even make a few swatches, which is actually a good idea that I need to start doing a bit more, and to see which fabric I prefer more. Because how many hours do I spend on the sweater? Tremendous amount of hours. And why do I need to skip this important step that is going to predict my future result? Just because I'm impatient to start? Well, that's not a valuable reason for me to risk so much. So I started to really swatch carefully, and I'm not going to start the project until I'm satisfied. And then we have the gauge of the project. I'm the person who is not playing with this, and I don't want to modify it. I don't want to think and count how many stitches more do I need to accommodate for the wrong gauge that I picked. I prefer to hit the gauge. And before, again, I was not the same person. I would just be like, oh, I just need a bit longer here, a bit more here, add stitches there. And in the end of the day, I'm not a professional designer with years and years of experience, right? I cannot just do that like that. I'm going to make mistakes, and my results are unpredictable, and it is very probable that they're not going to satisfy me. So after quite a few failures where I was not happy with the fit, or unraveling half of the project, I decided that I'm not going to play with this. If the design says this amount of rows have to be met, I'm going to do that. Of course, if it's like a simple raglan that goes continuously down, I can always add things. But then by adding length in the armhole, I'm adding stitches to the sleeve. Then my sleeve is going to be wider because my stitch gauge is correct, my row gauge is wrong. And what is going to be in the end happening is that my sleeves are going to be simply bigger than the designer's sample. And how do I know if I will like those sleeves? What if I don't like them? So even in a simple raglan where you think, oh, you can just add more length, it is still a risk to not be satisfied with the project. And I think the effort of meeting the correct gauge is way less than then trying to fix huge mistakes that are very often unfixable, and you have to either agree on the result or unravel the whole garment. Number 5 is I constantly try to master my techniques. There's endless things to master in knitting, right? But there's some basic things that we see in the garment that grab our attention and that actually define how polished the garment is. That is the neckline, the button band, the ribbing in the sleeves, and ribbing in the bottom. If there's ribbing or any sort of details. So besides, of course, the main garment, those little details define the look. They're actually polishing the finished look. They're finishing the garment. And if the neckline is loose or too tight, or the ribbing is inconsistent and messy, this is going to ruin the whole point. Everything that we discuss is going to be ruined in terms of that is not going to be looking polished if this is something that you're trying to achieve. When it comes to ribbing, sometimes it looks incredible and super polished in one yarn, and then the second yarn is just looking horrible to me. Same comes to the techniques. Something that works for one knitter, it doesn't work for me. My ribbing looks horrible with this technique. I think it's important to experiment and to learn a lot online. Luckily, we have a lot of different resources, and I was trying different ways of knitting. Some people even do German short row and they knit from the inside because it looks neater. And I think all of this effort makes sense because it's a very small amount of garment. It may take time, it may be super uncomfortable, especially if you pick smaller needles that actually help to achieve more neat ribbing. Maybe your hands hurt a bit, but it's a small amount that will really polish the whole finished look and you will be grateful. The same approach applies to any other issues. For example, rowing out is a big issue. If I see rowing out in the garment, I personally don't consider it as a polished knit, and I always do my best to avoid it. For example, I'm a big fan of cashmere yarns, and very often these yarns come in the chain construction, and these type of yarns are quite likely to show the rowing out. And the first thing that I do is I don't pick the light color, at least until I reach the point in my knitting where I don't have any rowing out issues. But I'm not there yet. So I know if it's cashmere, especially if it's a cardigan, I am not going to pick light color. Cream or white, these type of colors really show all of the details and all of the imperfections, including rowing out. And of course, we can master our technique. Take our time to learn from videos, learn new information, try them out, knit different swatches in different yarns. One yarn is amazing, another, for example, plant-based yarns or chain knit yarns, they show way more of rowing out. Some techniques work for one knitter, some techniques work for another. And so what we can do here is just to experiment, try, learn, and take our time to knit. And the final sixth way to improve our knits is to actually finish them, take our time to finish, because we were spending so much time, money, effort, and even our nerves on such project that it does deserve a proper finishing. What I mean by that is, first of all, any sort of finishing that requires elastic thread. So this top, again, has a lot of elastic everywhere, in the button band, in the neckline, in the armholes, and in the bottom. So insert the elastic thread if you think you will need one. Then of course wash it and block to measurements, and to really take your time to dry it in a beautiful shape. After it is dry, you can steam it. This is what usually designers do. That's why their work looks really polished on the pictures, because they steam the whole garment. They wait until it dries again after steaming. I prefer to steam while laying flat, because I notice if I steam it when it's hanging, the fabric is stretching a lot. Of course, in real life, where using the garment is not going to look as polished as the designer's pictures usually. but this is something to do. Now, I would like to hear your tips that I didn't mention today. For sure, I don't know everything about polished looks. Some tips that you would recommend or you can share from your experience. I would like to read and gain some new experience and gain some new knowledge, which is always fulfilling and nice. With that being said, thank you very much for watching, and I'm hoping to see you soon in my next video.